kiddos. We are here to talk about federalism, which is incredibly important. It's probably going to show up on your AP exam one way or another. Heck, if this is during the COVID crisis, we're all shut down, stuck in our houses. So this is definitely a master course in federalism. All I have to do is just look at the news, and you'll see just that issue between federal and state governments and that redefining of those roles. And it's pretty interesting to watch, actually, to say the least. So let's get moving. We have about 20 slides to get through, so hopefully it's not going to be as long as the last couple of videos. So moving on. What is federalism? Essentially, it has come out of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were set up in a way where the states were individual and they fought against each other, and there was a ton of conflict, and there was no real central government. Whereas now we have two sets of big government. We have national government, which is huge and expansive. Then we have state government, which is, obviously more local, and they work with one another. So those are really the only two types of governments that are established by the federal government: national and state. States do not derive their power from the national government, by the way. Asked from whom do they derive it? It is from you and me. States and the national government derive their power from us. The first three words of the Constitution, we the people, dictate that. The states as well do that. Other nations have that issue, and we'll talk about it more later, but they have unitary power, or they actually don't necessarily, states don't necessarily derive their power from the national government. However, recently, the states are used as an administrative arm of the national government. Essentially, what that means is that when the federal government makes a decision, like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the IDEA Act or Title IX, the states are in charge of actually carrying out those laws. They're executing those laws. They're given money by the federal government, but they still have to do it. So when you think of the governments, I said there's two big governments. Really, there's a lot more. Within the United States, there's about 80,000 different governments inside of there. We have 80,000 governments for about 340 million people. It's one national, 50 state, tens of thousands of local governments, and tens of thousands of special purpose districts. Local governments would be like municipalities, like towns or cities, counties, things like that. Whereas the special purpose districts are like school districts, so we're District 202, park districts, the Plainfield Park District, the Joliet Park District, the Barrington Park District, all that stuff. Fire districts, these are all specialized districts that are considered individual governments. They all work together. So we're seeing right now with the COVID crisis, a lot of issues are coming up with who's in charge of what, because there's a lot of different individual governments that are fighting against each other. Another great example would be Katrina. Katrina, back in 2005, basically decimated the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, namely New Orleans, but all the other states around there as well. And it was a failure of communication from every level, all the way from the lowest parish all the way up to the federal government. So this is a failure of federalism, but there's a lot of benefits to it as well, which we'll talk about. There's two types of governments, two types of federalism, I should say, that the College Board wants you to know. I don't think you should know this, but that's what they say. So there's two types. There's layer cake federalism, which is basically the state governments and the federal governments have their own spheres of influence, and they very rarely intersect. This is what federalism was back in the day. Right after the Constitution was ratified, states still maintained their autonomy. No one likes giving up political power. So they gave some to the federal government, but they had their own sphere. Federal government basically just said, like, we'll tax some things and then we'll deal with the international issues. And that was about it. As time went on, throughout the 1930s or so, we started to kind of meld those two spheres of influence. And nowadays we deal with what's called marble cake federalism, where, again, like I said, the states are kind of the administrative arm of the federal government. It's hard to see where the state or the federal government ends and the state begins. That's what that is. They're all kind of mixed up. Again, I think that's stupid because you guys are basically college-level students, and it's ridiculous to say that you guys should think of federalism as cakes. What it really is this. It's much uglier than cake, but let me just kind of break it down for you. That big oval in the center is the people. That's sovereign. That's where all power begins. All power comes from you and me, the people. On the right, the top right up there, you see the federal government. There's that bold line that's two ended with it's like a ray, right? Ray line. It's a line. It's a line. Geometry. It's a line. Which basically means the federal government deals with us immediately, directly. We deal with them directly. We have immediate consequences for one another. So, a great example: the federal government passes tax cuts. We are affected by that immediately. When my wife and I got married, she changed her name, and she had to go to the Social Security Administration, and she had to deal with the federal government directly. We immediately affect each other. All right, so their power comes from us, and their policies directly affect us. On the other end, it gets more complicated. You see that state and federal government dotted line there. So basically, that represents the always dynamic, always changing relationship between state and federal governments. Like we said, like those two types of federalism. That's what that represents. It's always changing. There's certain levels of participation. Sometimes states get more power. Sometimes federal government gets more power. But it's always changing. Now, on the far left side, those three squares, what this is essentially saying is straight up from the people colon sovereign, you see state government. That means we give our power to the state government. We directly affect the state government through taxes, through referendums, which is a change of policy that's voted on directly by us. An example of referendum would be us wanting to give more money and taxes towards the library. We would vote on that directly. So we affect them directly. We also vote on state representatives and things like that. And then what the state does is that the state, Illinois, Springfield does not affect us directly. What Illinois actually does is that they make policy, they make laws. So things like you have to pass the Constitution exam. You have to go through 180 some odd days, 170 some odd days of school in order to make it a full school day. That sort of thing. They make those decisions, but they don't actually carry that out. What they do is they give power to local and special districts, like local governments and special districts, and tell them to carry it out. So, like the Constitution exam, 170 some odd days to actually, go through a full year, that goes through special districts, a school district, District 202. I'm actually part of the executive branch. My job is to carry out Illinois law. So again, you guys have to pass the Constitution exam. You guys have to go through 170 some odd days of school. You guys have to do certain things. I'm in charge of making sure you do that. Another one is voting laws. Illinois has a whole bunch of voting laws. Like you can actually register to vote the day of the election. Who carries that out? It's not the state of Illinois. It's the local government. It's the Will County clerk does that. And they do this. When you go to actually vote, it's ran by the county. It's not ran by the state government. So we mostly interact with local governments and the federal government. Springfield, we pretty much never interact with. That's what it is. Cake is much easier to understand. This is how it really is. So you're welcome for the confusion. Moving on. This is another way of looking at it. Cooperative federalism is a way of looking at where you have the federal government overall over everything, and they make all these policies, and a lot of these policies affect states as well. Other types of systems. We have confederal. You don't really have to know this for the Constitution exam, but it's good to know. There's a confederal system, which is not underlined like unitary system. I apologize for the screwing up of the template, but confederal system is basically a bunch of individual states, a bunch of individual governments, and they give a certain amount of sovereignty to a central entity. So, like the Confederacy during the Civil War, those dirty traitors, those individual 11 states, they gave some of their power to Richmond in order to help carry out the war. So there's 13 stars on the flag, but there's only 11 states. It just kind of shows the ineptitude of the stupid Confederacy. Anyway, you also have the European Union. That's a successful confederacy where you have 20 some odd states, countries that give up some economic power to a central government in order to make it easier to kind of trade. Kind of goes along with the Articles of Confederation. They were a confederal system, and we kind of fell apart because we didn't give any economic powers to them. So the European Union kind of learned from our mistake. Brexit be darned. Another one is unitary system. This is where basically the centralized government gets all of its power, or has all the power, and they exercise it all over smaller units of government. So, like Britain, France, Spain, they're all unitary governments because their history has led to that, right? Like you had feudal system, you had like anarchy after the Roman Empire fell. Then you had um, individual tribes. Then you had the feudal system, and then you had like the absolute kings, and they consolidated power, and then that eventually turned into democracy. So they, like in Nottingham, England, if they want to create like put a new stop sign, they have the power to do that. But the only reason why they have the power to do that is because of the national government. Whereas in the United States, if like Plainfield wanted to put another sign up or a roundabout somewhere, they could do it because they have the power to do that thanks to Illinois, not because of the national government. But states themselves are unitary governments. So like Illinois, if they wanted to, they can take away the incorporation of Plainfield like that. They can vote for it and say Plainfield's no longer a city or a village. They wouldn't do that, but they have the power to do that. All power is vested with Illinois within its borders. I feel like this is going long, so we'll get moving on pretty quick. So, the evolution of federalism. So again, federalism started out as layer cake, or as dual federalism, as we call it, where you have two different spheres of influence, and as time went on, it got closer together. So at first, states were on equal footing with the national government because it was basically just like we'll deal with different things, almost like co-equal administrative arms of the government. Some of the things that kind of show that was like nullification crisis when South Carolina didn't want to deal with certain types of like tariffs and stuff, and Jackson said, "Well, I'm going to go down there and murder as many people as I can." And South Carolina backed off because they realized how much of a crazy person Andrew Jackson was. The Fugitive Slave Act was another one. Southern states wanted to say that northern states had to give up their sovereignty to look after people who they thought were slaves. And also, the common vernacular was the United States are doing this. So, like, the United States are going to war with Britain. The United States are establishing this tariff. So it was much like you were a Virginian before you were an American. But the Civil War changes everything. The national government, after killing about 70,000 or 700,000 people, they basically established that they are in charge, and that helped establish the supremacy of the national government more so than like other court cases that happened beforehand. And then the vernacular eventually changed to the United States is as a singular noun. The other court case I was trying to think of was McCulloch v. Maryland. So, long story short, you have to learn about this in your central documents anyway. But basically, McCulloch v. Maryland said that the national government had implied powers, and the states can't impede upon those national government's powers. It was the Supremacy Clause and the Elastic Clause. They're able to create stuff that wasn't necessarily in the Constitution, and you can't necessarily go after, or you can't nullify anything the national government has done. So basically, they created a bank. The Maryland tried to tax it. They said the ability to tax is the ability to destroy, and the Supreme Court said you can't tax the national government. So they basically clarified very important aspects of the national government. The Commerce Clause was part of this. Basically, it says that the federal government is able to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and within the Indian tribes. So they're able to regulate interstate commerce, which is everything. Interstate commerce is everything. If I'm doing this right now on YouTube, and YouTube is regulated by the federal government because it goes across state lines. They even changed the meaning of commerce, saying that commerce is more than just the trading of goods. It is intercourse, which is an inappropriate thing to say by a Supreme Court justice, but it is anything. It's ideas going across state lines. Even if I am a subsistence farmer and I am only farming within my area and I'm not taking any seeds or any fertilizer from anything outside of my state, I am still affecting interstate commerce because I'm not participating in it. Supreme Court has ruled that by not participating in interstate commerce, you are affecting interstate commerce. Therefore, you can be regulated by the Commerce Clause, which regulates interstate commerce. It's bananas, but it's very far-reaching, and it gives Congress the ability to regulate pretty much anything. There has been some pushback, but ultimately, like Civil Rights Acts, Voting Rights Acts, this is all affects interstate commerce. If they were okay, so if you can just connect anything to interstate commerce, you're pretty much good as far as the federal government being able to pass a law about it. I already talked about this. I already talked about this. Okay, so like I said earlier, originally we had dual federalism. So that was basically the government, like state governments and federal governments were on equal footing. As time went on, though, we came up with what's called cooperative federalism. It developed during the 20th century and emphasizes cooperation between the national and state governments. Essentially, when the states started needing more money from the federal government, that's when they started to start going along with what the federal government said. It also came about because of the income tax. The 16th Amendment gave the government, the federal government, the ability to tax you and your income and my income, which just exponentially inflated the amount of money the federal government got. So think of it as the federal government's dealing in trillions of dollars, whereas state governments are dealing in billions of dollars. It doesn't seem like a big difference, but think of it like this: there has not been a trillion seconds since Julius Caesar was born. A trillion seconds is about 35,000 years. So there hasn't even been recorded history a trillion seconds ago. A billion is a lot, but it's like, I don't know, like 100 years or something like that. So that's how long it's been. But yeah, so trillions of dollars. So the federal government, or the state governments rely on federal government money. And that's kind of where things kind of change in the 1930s with cooperative federalism because states had no money, the federal government had it, and they want to try to push through things like the NRA, the CCC, the TVA, all those alphabet soup organizations. Anyway, as time went on, Richard Nixon came up with this idea of the devolution of federalism. Nixon was a Republican. Nixon likes small federal government. They think that most government should happen at the local level because the local level is closer to you and me, and they feel as if they know what our wants and needs are. It's more efficient that way. So he devolved. Evolution is getting up, like we evolved from like lower primates. Devolution is going back. They felt like we should give some power from the federal government all the way down to the states. This is called New Federalism or the Devolution of Federalism. Eventually, it becomes Fiscal Federalism, which is basically the federal government makes mandates that the states need to carry out, and they give them money for that. Not all money, so like they can give like 90% of it, and the states have to pay 10% of it, but they do give them some money for it. This is a question that I'm not going to have you guys answer right now. Fiscal federalism. So this is the step I just talked about. One, two, three. These are called mandates. Unfunded mandates are called unfunded mandates. They're technically against the law, but they still kind of do it. One other kind of dirty trick is that the federal government sets up something like motor voter laws, where if you do anything with the DMV, you automatically get registered to vote. They pass that law. It's great. They fund like 95% of it. And then as time goes on, they realize it's not effective, so Congress stops funding it, but states still want to do it. So they say, okay, we'll only fund 50% of it. So now the states are on the hook for 45% more of that. So it really affects them a lot. That's sort of like kind of an issue with fiscal federalism is they can change the amount of funding from budget to budget, and you have to get a new budget every single year. So states almost have to wait for the national government to make a budget for them to make their own. This is called the carrot and the stick. Basically, they're saying if the states do this, they'll get money for it, and they get the benefit of actually doing a new process that's usually good for the state. But if they don't, they're gonna get them. So there's different types of carrots. And these are different types of grants. Grants just money that comes from the federal government. A grant in aid is basically the states carry out the mandate and they get the money, i.e., the highway transit system. So if the states carry out and they actually create and maintain the highway transit system, the highways, they get money from the federal government for doing this. Another one is block grants. Block grants are something that states love. So basically, what the federal government says is like, okay, here, Illinois, here is $2 billion for medicine, just medical stuff, whatever you want to do. You can train more EMTs. You can put money towards hospitals. You can pay for the insurance on ambulances. Whatever you want to do, you can do it. And states love it. It's like if your parents say, okay, you're going out tonight, here's $20. Do whatever you want with it. Um, it's much better. Revenue sharing, we'll get back to that. What? Screwed up. So, okay, so that's block grants. Let's go back to this. This is grants and aid. It should be categorical grants, is what it should be called. I'll actually change that after this video. Categorical grants is essentially like this said, you can do this, but I'm going to give you money for it. States don't like that much because they're being told what to do and they kind of lose power when that happens. But it's basically saying, like, okay, do you want $20 million to pay or to create this $30 million stretch of highway? Well, yes, states are going to want that, but they're not necessarily going to like it because they're being told what to do. That's what a categorical grant is. It takes power away from the states because basically the federal government's like, I'm bankrolling you, so you're definitely going to do what I say. They're not a fan of that. Whereas block grants are like, federal government's just like, here's some cash, do what you want with it. So block grants give more money to the states. Revenue sharing isn't really much of a thing anymore, but Nixon kind of started it where they actually would give a certain amount of the income tax that would come to the federal government back directly to the cities, the municipalities, or the counties. And the states hated that because the counties were constructs of the states. So you're basically bypassing the only other level of government that was mentioned in the Constitution. They were not cool with this. So this eventually went away with Reagan. But it's almost like if like grandparents come on over and give their grandkids like a whole bunch of candy, and the parents are like, "Dude, I gotta get these kids to sleep. What the heck's going on?" And the grandparents are like, "Yeah, it sucks, deuces, I'm out." That's pretty much what this was all about. So that didn't last very long. We don't really do that too much anymore. And this is a question about actually an FRQ that you guys can work on if you'd like, but I'm not going to make you guys do that right now. And basically, I talked about all these sticks already. You can look at this already. You should look at it, but I already kind of talked about this. So the role of the state today. State's power is called like having this like the state Illinois, the ability to actually make anything or do any laws or any policy is called the police power. They are able to protect the public's health, welfare, and morals. This is all established by the 10th Amendment, where it said that any rights not given to the federal government, or any powers not given to the federal government, are given to the people and the state. So the state basically anything in our Illinois Constitution is set up because of the 10th Amendment, and that's why like Romeoville is able to set a curfew of like 10:30 for people who are under the age of 18, and Joliet can do it at 11, and so on and so forth. Or like Illinois can say, okay, you can smoke marijuana, but Indiana says no. Or Illinois says you can't smoke until you're 21, but Indiana's like do it at 15 because they don't care. Um, I don't know if that's true. It's probably not true. But anyway, like they can do that sort of thing. Like they can actually regulate that. Like in morals too, which is interesting. In Illinois, adultery is against the law, so you can't cheat on your wife or your husband. You're not gonna get thrown in jail for it, but like they have the ability to do that stuff thanks to the 10th Amendment. That's like our version, Illinois' version of the necessary and proper clause. They can make any law they need that affects that. So like voting, things like that. Anything that's not in the Constitution, the states are in charge of. Another set of questions I'm not going to ask you. So some problems with federalism. And again, we're seeing a lot with the COVID stuff going on right now, the coronavirus issues. Unfunded mandates, I talked about that. Devolution of responsibilities to the states. This says welfare reform. So essentially, each state deals with welfare in their own way, and it's pretty expensive. So a good example is like right now, the unemployment rate in Illinois in the United States is might possibly get up to 30%, which is the most it's ever been in the United States history. States have never paid, or federal government's never paid for more than 56% of unemployment. It's going to really exceed that. So it's really going to tax states' ability to pay for it. Federal government may have to jump into that. This all comes from devolution, where states make up their own responsibilities or their own levels to actually qualify for certain things. The retrenchment of federal programs, like I said, like that motor voter thing. So they in the 1990s, federal government passed a law saying that anyone who does anything in DMV, which is state owned, gets registered to vote. But they found out that that doesn't really increase the amount of voters, so they stopped paying for it. Certain states like Illinois actually did like that, so they kept it up, but they had to pay for it then. So they actually is a more of an issue on their budget. a stress on their budget. Increased state responsibilities, increased state fiscal burdens. Again, that's kind of goes along with that. Environmental problems. Who fixes environmental problems? There is a lot more smog coming out of California than, say, Washington State. However, Nevada has to deal with it. So, what is Nevada? How does Nevada deal with the air pollution coming from California? Should California pay for it? Should the federal government? We don't know. So that's some of the big issues that rise because of federalism. And this is the last slide. You listen to the whole thing. I don't even know how long it is. It's probably been 25 minutes. So thank you for listening. Kiddos, you are ready for this AP exam if it's only dealing with Unit 1. I will see you next unit. Thank you.